Well, this is awkward. This is getting uncomfortable. Are we doing this or not? What are we waiting for? Hey, Nassau Presbyterian Church. It's great to see you again. Well, not necessarily see you. You can see me, but I can't see you. You're kind of ruining the vibe here. It's just weird because I'm saying this in October and you're in November and space-time continuum. Okay, what we mean to say is that it's great to be back at Nassau Pres Adult Ed again, and that you're stuck with us for the next 4 weeks. Welcome to the Art of Advent. I'm Jason Oosting, and for the next 4 weeks, we will be looking at works of art that will help us understand what Advent is all about, and hopefully give us some insight into how we're preparing ourselves as we await the celebration of Christmas. Advent is a season of waiting. It's the 4 Sundays before Christmas. Culturally, we tend to skip over Advent and jump straight to Christmas. We call it Christmas time after all. There's Christmas creep in the stores every year. We go to Christmas parties, not Advent parties. Advent seems to get overlooked somehow. Hold up. There's a war on Advent now? Did you read that on Facebook? Are we getting riled up about this? I can feel myself getting riled up about this. I can feel myself getting more hyperbolic by the nanosecond. Wait, a war on Advent. So sad. Wait, are we part of the war or are we fighting against it? Or is this whole Advent thing just another part of the war on Christmas? Wait, what are we doing about this? Online petitions? Candlelight vigils? Forming a super PAC? We need to act. No, we need to wait. There is no war on Advent. Yet. Advent is all about waiting. But what are we waiting for? Jesus? Exactly. The birth of Jesus Christ. Wow. That almost never works. Waiting is hard. But how are we waiting? Hopefully? Anxiously? Excitedly? Despondently? And what are we waiting for now that Jesus has already been born, crucified, and resurrected? I want us to start this series by looking at 3 works of art that will help us think about how we're waiting and what we're waiting for this Advent. When I was thinking of waiting, this painting by Mary Cassatt came to mind. It just exudes boredom. Yeah, I'm feeling that. It isn't a religious painting, obviously, unless you see it as a painting of a little girl just before she has to go to church. So what does this have to do with Advent? You're going to do that thing where you say a bunch of fancy art history words and turn a simple painting about a girl in a chair into something completely different, like the difference between being and becoming, aren't you? No. Well, kind of. Cassatt was a major part of the Impressionist movement in the late 19th century, and along with Bertha Morisot, she was one of the 2 female artists who exhibited with the group, and the only American. She was friends with all the big-name Impressionists, Monet and Renoir, and especially Edgar Degas, who actually painted a little bit of the background of this painting. This is a scene that those male artists would not and probably could not have painted, given the fact that Kids' Playroom was not the domain of a man in 1878. One could look at Cassatt's choice of subject as a result of her own marginalization. But even if she's just playing the hand that she's been dealt, Cassatt is not playing by the normal rules here. She has given us a window into childhood without the kind of stilted expectations we normally see in portraits of children. This is not a prim and proper little girl sitting up straight and smiling politely. There's no etiquette and no manners. Slumped on the brilliantly turquoise armchair, this anonymous girl, the daughter of a friend of Degas, is a vision of life before screens. Who knows what she's waiting for, but we know this at least. She's a little girl in 1878. She's not in control of anything in her life. She has no choice but to wait. And neither do we. I think control is such a huge part of how we engage with waiting in our lives. We seek to control as many variables as possible. But in waiting for the Messiah, God breaking into this world, we are not in control. That happens on God's time, not ours. So we wait. Maybe she's a little bored, but maybe she's just finally free for a moment, waiting for the next scheduled thing in her life to begin. She's all dressed up. She's got a white dress on, bow in her hair, matching sash and socks. But we're catching this girl at a moment where she's been left to her own devices. You can just imagine her mother or a nanny walking in a minute later and scolding her for slouching or wrinkling her dress. But Mom's not here yet. We've been given a snapshot of life in between performances. And like her, we all perform for others to some extent, especially between Thanksgiving and Christmas. That's a very interesting political opinion, Uncle So-and-so. I will definitely consider the merits of that argument and potentially change my own opinion. I will also look for more information on that person's internet blog. It's a performative kind of waiting. I'm keeping it all together, everything is wonderful, but all I want to do is slump down in a turquoise armchair kind. Maybe we're longing for a moment to let our guard down, especially for feeling swept along in a current of Christmas shopping, Advent shopping, Christmas parties, Advent parties, performances, work, church, family obligations, etc., etc. It's so easy to feel the need to meet everyone else's expectations this time of year. And it's often easier to wait if we can feel like we're filling up the time. But looking at our girl here, I see someone who's waiting without performing, or seeking to set the terms or control the agenda. There's a certain sense of freedom in this scene, as if she's made her peace with waiting. Even the dog is taking a nap. Perhaps she's exhausted after performing at a social gathering, or silently dreading the next family obligation. There's something about a child's perception of the world's priorities that may be helpful for us this Advent. Presence. The way they simplify. Presence. See through or just plain ignore all the stress that adults tend to put on themselves. Presence. If we could wait this Advent without seeking to control all the variables or filling up every available minute, we may find that we're better prepared for Christmas rather than just relieved that it's over. Well, what if we're waiting for the wrong thing? Jewish people living in first century Palestine weren't waiting for Jesus of Nazareth, cousin of John the Baptist. They were waiting for a military or political ruler who would free them from Roman subjugation. One can understand their longing. It had been over a half a millennium since they had been taken into captivity, living under Assyrian or Babylonian or Persian rule, far away from the land God had promised them. And now that they were back, they had to submit to the Romans. How were they ever going to bounce back from this? Our next painting also comes from the 19th century, and it definitely has an aura of despondency amid the ruins of a glorious past. It's called Abbey in the Oakwood, and was painted by Caspar David Friedrich between 1808 and 1810. The scene is the ruins of a medieval church, surrounded by an oak forest in winter. If you look closely, there's a line of hooded monks carrying a casket toward the ruins. It is a scene suffused with death. A funeral procession at the end of the day, in the dead of winter, through dead trees, ending at a dead building. Okay, downer. As a romanticist, Friedrich was part of a movement that valued emotion and passion over the logic and reason of the Enlightenment. They sought meaning in the natural world, and often juxtaposed humanity with the sublime force of nature. We certainly see that here. The ruins are obviously the remnant of a Gothic church, a monumental work of architecture in a style designed to dominate its surroundings and manipulate, if not defy, natural forces like light and gravity. It's the product of innumerable human hands and hours, and the source of pride for cities and nations. But trees now loom over the ruined stonework, which in its completed form would have towered over the landscape. The stained glass windows are long gone, and the delicate tracery that once held them in place is crumbling. The anonymous humans are dwarfed by both, hardly even noticeable without closer inspection. Yet their activity, laying to rest a decaying body and a decaying building, further underscores that sense of mourning and loss. So, Christmas? There certainly is an element of longing for the good old days here, which is common in many romantic works, longing for a better, simpler time. But the good old days were almost never as good as we remember them, and may not have been good at all for some people. Friedrich may have been tapping into a kind of national angst, a longing for the good old days when it was Gothic cathedrals, not factory smokestacks, that dominated the surrounding landscapes. Now this could lead one perhaps to a rather mopey reading of the painting, one where the ruins of the church represent the death of Christian hegemony and the surrounding trees then an encroaching secular paganism. But the Romanticists weren't necessarily secularists. They often saw God in nature, And that gives us a very different reading of this painting, because as much as death dominates this canvas, there are signs of hope. The building may be dead, but come spring, the trees will awaken and their leaves will grow again. Even the barely visible moon, a waxing crescent, could be a sign of new life and growth, although its presence does let us know that this is sunset. Perhaps it's a call to realize the frailty and transience of human accomplishments, even monumental works like Gothic cathedrals. A realization that the good old days are an empty place to put one's hope. A realization that the control that we humans try to exert over our surroundings has its limits, and that God's creation has a power and permanence that far outstrips human ingenuity. So where do we place our faith? In the human achievements of an idealized past, or in our Creator and the promise of resurrection? These monks are bearing their friend, but I think we can assume that they have hope in the resurrection. And Friedrich alludes to it, not through the institutional power of the church, but through the natural forces of our Creator, for whom, as I said earlier, time has a very different meaning. As people live and die, as buildings rise and fall, the promise of resurrection still exists in this place through the knowledge that what we're seeing is not a permanent reality. The promise of resurrection can be seen in the trees, which will bloom again in the spring, the sun, which will rise again tomorrow, and the phases of the moon, whose Creator has extended the same gift to us through the one we wait for during Advent, the shoot from the stump of Jesse. Our last painting will help remind us why people were waiting for a shoot from the stump of Jesse in the first place. It's from an artist that you may have heard of, although he didn't consider himself to be much of a painter. We're going to be looking at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Seriously? First a random bored girl, then a gloomy winter landscape, and now the 16th chapel. Have you even heard of Christmas? You do realize that this is Nassau Presbyterian Church adult education, right? This is like the World Series of Mid-Atlantic religious-based university-adjacent adult education. It's going to work. Trust me. It's your funeral. The content of the Sistine Chapel ceiling actually points us directly to the necessity of the birth of Christ. It was redone between 1508 and 1512, when Pope Julius II decided that he wanted a more spectacular ceiling than the blue vault with gold stars, similar to the one seen here, that had originally covered the chapel. His uncle, Pope Sixtus IV, had the Sistine Chapel built and decorated with huge frescoes done by the leading artists of the day, featuring the lives of Moses and of Jesus. But a new ceiling was a way for Julius to improve upon his uncle's masterpiece. It's made up of 3 main sections: 9 central panels that go down the center portion of the vault, 12 large figures painted on the curved section of the vault with 4 additional scenes in the corners, and then finally a host of figures representing the 40 generations leading up to the birth of Christ. The whole program basically answers the questions: why do we need Jesus, who predicted his birth, and how long had people been waiting? The 9 central panels are the most famous part of the ceiling, and they answer the question why we need Jesus in the first place. The first 5 panels tell the story of creation, starting with the separation of light and dark, and going to the creation of Adam and Eve. The 6th panel shows the fall, where Adam and Eve ruin everything by eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Thanks a lot. And are cast out of the Garden of Eden in shame. The final 3 panels show the flood narrative, featuring the deluge, Noah's sacrifice afterwards, and the drunkenness of Noah. And there you have it in a nutshell. God created everything perfect, Adam and Eve ruin everything with the original sin, and then God's judgment almost destroys the entire world. The only thing that can restore that original created order is Jesus. But there's a whole lot of time between Noah and the birth of Christ. The people of Israel do their will they, won't they dance with God for a few thousand years, going in and out of slavery, conquering and being conquered, which leads us to the second level. These are the prophets and Sybils, people that prophesied the coming of the Messiah. They're the largest figures on the ceiling, ranging between 13 and 15 feet tall. The prophets include Zechariah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Joel, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jonah, who wasn't as much a prophet of the coming of the Messiah as he was a popular image of a prefiguration of Christ, what with being eaten by a fish and puked up 3 days later. I'm guessing most of these names are fairly familiar, But the female figures may be less so. They certainly share the same monumental and sculptural qualities as the prophets, as well as the appearance of having taken huge quantities of human growth hormone. But they come from an entirely different tradition. These are the Sybils, ancient Greek prophets, who are included here not just to balance out what would be a fairly dude-heavy composition with some female figures, but to signify the fact that the salvation brought by the coming Messiah would be for all people, not just the Israelites. An important fact for a bunch of Italian Catholics. They come from areas all around the Mediterranean, which also points to the call to go and make disciples of all nations. Starting in the 4th century, some Christian scholars looked back at their prophecies, such as the Cumaean Sybils prophecy of the coming Golden Age, and interpreted them as referring to the birth of Christ. This is classic Neoplatonism. Yes. It's also quite diaphanoidal. See, I can make up words too. Neoplatonism was an ideology that became popular in the late 15th century and basically consisted of mixing Christian images and ideals with ancient Greek humanism. Think Michelangelo's David or Donatello's David, or any of the Davids really. In 1481, a Dominican friar named Filippo Barbieri had published a book on the oracles of the Sybils, which likely influenced Michelangelo in the way he depicted them. Pope Julius II was a major Neoplatonist, so it's not surprising that they would include ancient Greek figures, or that surrounding the 9 central panels and the prophets and Sybils are just a ton of random naked dudes. Just like in ancient Greece. Tucked away in the corners, Michelangelo included 4 scenes from Jewish history in which God's people are being saved from destruction of one type or another. There's the bronze serpent, which spared the Israelites from a horrible plague if they looked at it, David cutting the head off Goliath, the execution of Haman, whose plot to kill the Jews was foiled by Esther, and Judith and her servant sneaking away with the decapitated head of the Assyrian general Holofernes, whose armies had besieged the Israelites. Each scene is a reminder of a moment of great salvation for the people of God, but also insufficient in and of itself, therefore pointing to the need for true salvation in Jesus Christ. The last level is the least iconic, but the part that most explicitly points to Jesus. These are the ancestors of Christ. Dozens more muscular figures. He did have a type, didn't he? Who have eluded identification by art historians for centuries now. Many have tried to definitively identify each figure, but that likely misses the point. It's not about who they are, but more about how many they are. A reminder of how long the people of God waited for the Messiah, as well as a flesh and blood reminder of Christ's humanity. So Michelangelo did all this between 1508 and 1512, and ended up creating one of the most astounding, game-changing, iconic works of art of all time. What many people don't know is that he didn't want to do it at all. Michelangelo was a sculptor, not a painter. Yes, he had been trained in painting as a young artist, but his fame had come as a result of his skills as a sculptor, and that's where his passion was. He had been planning a massive sculptural program for the tomb of Pope Julius II, but that all got put on hold once the Pope got interested in the ceiling and chose Michelangelo to paint it. So in the prime of his career, Michelangelo was thrust into a period of waiting. He was convinced that his enemies had conspired against him. People like Bramante and Raphael, who were from Urbino, not Florence, encouraging the Pope to choose him for the commission, knowing that he wasn't a painter and hoping that he would embarrass himself. Classic Urbinoans. Urbinoites? Once he ran away to Florence, prompting the Pope to send armed guards to bring him back. He argued with his patron so much that allegedly at one point, the Pope threatened to throw him off of the scaffolding. He even wrote a sonnet complaining about the whole process to a friend named Giovanni, ending with, "John, come to the rescue of my dead painting now, and of my honor. I'm not in a good place, and I'm no painter." This is not the image we typically envision when we think of one of the greatest artists of all time, especially when he's talking about one of the greatest paintings of all time. But I think it's helpful to see that even when we find ourselves in a place where we feel frustrated, held back, or even sabotaged, there are still opportunities for us to contribute, even if we feel like we're not interested or even qualified. There was actually a period of waiting right in the middle of the whole project. Once he had finished the first half of the ceiling, The huge scaffolding that he had designed and constructed needed to be taken down and moved in order to finish the project. It covered about half of the area of the entire chapel, and so it took about a month for it to be taken down and reconstructed under the second half of the ceiling. He seems to have done some serious thinking while waiting for everything to be moved, because when he comes back, his depiction of God becomes far more dynamic and powerful. The poses are more challenging, twisted and foreshortened. Because of his lack of confidence in his own abilities, Michelangelo chose to paint the 9 central panels in reverse chronological order, starting with the Noah narrative, hoping to improve his technique before taking on the challenge of painting God. The last panel that he painted before making the switch was the creation of Eve. After about a month of waiting, resting, and planning, Michelangelo climbed back up onto the scaffolding and painted what has become one of the most iconic images in the history of art. The creation of Adam is an image that pulses with energy. You can feel the anticipation as God stretches out, focusing all thought and power on this moment of giving life to a still, lifeless Adam, whose limp hand is just inches away from receiving the spark of life. It's quite a contrast to the creation of Eve. Yeah. Birth of Adam. God is dynamic, powerful, reaching out, hair blowing in the wind, focusing all energy on this moment of creating the first human life. Birth of Eve? Okay, fine. I guess you can be a human too. So what made the difference? Michelangelo had to wait. It gave him an opportunity to reimagine the project, a project that he still didn't want to do. But it seems that a month of waiting gave him some clarity, some insight, some inspiration to finish this masterpiece. A masterpiece that was so game-changing for painting that allegedly when his younger rival, Raphael, a man who was far more renowned for his painting skills and who was creating his own masterpieces nearby in the Stanza della Signatura, snuck into the chapel at one point, hoping to check on Michelangelo's progress and perhaps hoping to see a huge embarrassing failure for his moody Florentine rival. He was awestruck. He spoke of it as a new way of painting and went back to his own masterpiece, the School of Athens, and chipped off a section of the fresco and immortalized Michelangelo as the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, doing his best to copy the twisted sculptural style of the figures that he had seen 100 feet above him on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So what you're saying, basically, is that if there's something I have to do that I don't want to do, I should just procrastinate for a month, and then I'll come back and make the next 16th chapel. No, that's not... This is brilliant. I can make a fortune. This is not some kind of self-help. Hello, friends. Are you bored? Do you have something to do that you don't want to do? Is your boss annoying? Are you unsure about your qualifications or abilities? Well, I have the answer. Wait 1 month, and you will come back and achieve the greatest success of your life. To fully understand my groundbreaking method, please send $5,000 to... Advent isn't about easy answers or quick self-help schemes. It's about time. Time we've been given to reflect on what we're waiting for and how we're waiting for it. The joy and promise of Christmas is what we rightly long for, but it's not here yet. So we wait. We wait during Advent. We wait for the coming of the Messiah, for salvation, for justice, for peace, for the kingdom of God. We have no choice but to wait, because our time is not God's time. The question is, what will we do with our time? And that's all the time that we have for today. Next week, we'll be taking a look at paintings that depict one of the first moments leading up to the birth of Christ, the Annunciation. Hope to see you next time. Well, not see you exactly. Dude, we already did this joke. See you next week.